The bell for vigils had not yet rung. Below the tower at Monte Cassino, the brothers lay asleep in the dormitory, worn from the day's labor, and the mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath. It was somewhere in the last years of Benedict's life, past midnight, the hour when the old monk kept his private watch at the window before the community rose to sing the praises of God in the dark. He had done this for years, risen alone before the bell, to pray while the world around him slept. On this night, everything changed. A light broke over him, not the gray coming on of dawn, not torchlight, not anything the tower had seen before. Gregory of Rome, who wrote Benedict's life within a generation of his death, and preserved the memory of the monks who had known him, tells us the light banished the very dark of night, and shone with a splendor greater than the sun at noon. And in that light, gathered before Benedict's eyes, as if drawn together and made small enough to hold, was the whole world, every kingdom of it, every sea and shore, gathered, Gregory says, as though it had been drawn together under a single ray of light. Down below, a deacon named Servandus, a guest in the monastery that night, was startled from sleep by the same brightness. He did not see all that Benedict saw, only a fragment of the light, enough to know something immense was passing over the mountain. He came to Benedict's side and found the old man standing at the window, staring out at something Servandus could not fully perceive, his face turned toward a vastness that had no visible edge. Benedict called him closer and told him plainly what he beheld. The whole world, gathered as under one ray of the sun. And more than that, in the same light, he saw the soul of a man he knew, Germanus, Bishop of Capua, being carried up into heaven inside a globe of fire, borne by angels. Benedict did not keep this to himself as a private treasure to be turned over in silence, though he might have. He sent at once for a devout man named Theoprobus, wanting a third witness, but the vision had already closed before Theoprobus arrived, and Benedict had to content himself with the testimony he and Servandus already carried between them. Then he did something more remarkable still. He sent messengers down the mountain to Capua to learn whether Germanus, the bishop, was well. The messengers traveled, asked, and returned with their answer. Germanus had died. He had died that very night, at that very hour, the hour of the light at the tower window. This is the moment I want you to stand inside before we go anywhere else. Not because it is the strangest story about Benedict of Nursia, though it may be, but because it is the truest window we have into who this man actually was, and why, 15 centuries later, we are still trying to understand him. Here is a monk near the end of a long life, alone at a window in the dead of night, praying as he always prayed, when the boundary between what is seen and what is real simply gives way. The whole world, Rome and Constantinople, the barbarian kingdoms pressing at the old empire's crumbling edges, the farms and rivers and roads he himself had walked as a young man, fleeing everything he had once been taught to want, all of it gathered into a single ray of light, small enough to be seen at once, small enough to be held. And a soul he knew, a friend in the episcopate, rising through that same light toward God at the very moment his body failed in a city 50 miles away. When his monks asked him afterward how such a thing was possible, how a man standing at one window could see the whole of creation at a glance, Benedict did not reach for elaborate explanation. He said, in effect, that it is no great wonder for a soul that has learned to see the Creator to find the whole of creation small by comparison. Gregory records the sense of it plainly. To the soul that has fixed itself on the light of God, The entire visible world shrinks to something you could hold in your two hands, because you have finally seen the thing beside which all else is small. That single sentence is the key to this entire book, because everything else you are about to learn about Benedict of Nursia, the frightened boy who left Rome rather than watch himself become someone he despised, the young hermit who lived 3 years in a cave above Subiaco, eating what a single faithful monk lowered to him on a rope, the man who built, argued, forgave, buried a jealous rival's plots, gathered broken men into community after community, wrote 73 chapters and a prologue that would outlive every empire of his lifetime. All of it is the story of a man patiently, deliberately, sometimes painfully learning to see God first, so that when he finally stood at that tower window near the end of his days, the world had already grown small enough in his sight to be seen whole. This did not happen to him overnight. Nothing about Benedict happened overnight. That is, in fact, the entire point of him. We live in an age that loves the sudden, the overnight conversion, the single blinding flash that changes everything, the dramatic turn that can be told in one sentence and shared in one image. Benedict gives us almost nothing like that. What he gives us instead is something far harder to romanticize and far more useful to imitate. A life built one deliberate year upon another, one small fidelity compounding into the next, until a man who started as a frightened student, fleeing the corruption of Rome, became, by the end, someone who could stand at a window and see the whole of creation folded into a single ray of light, not because God handed him a shortcut, but because Benedict had spent decades doing the slow, unglamorous work of staying. Staying is the word I want you to hold on to as we go. Benedict's contemporaries were fleeing everywhere in those years, fleeing a collapsing Roman world, fleeing barbarian invasion, fleeing plague and famine, and the general sense that the whole structure of civilization was coming apart at the seams, which, in the 6th century, it more or less was. Benedict himself began his own life with a flight, away from Rome, away from a path toward the very kind of prestige and comfort most young men of his class were groomed to want. But his flight from Rome was not the beginning of a wandering life. It was the beginning of a rooted one. He went into the wilderness above Subiaco, and, in a cave the tradition calls the Sacro Specco, the sacred cave, he stopped moving. For 3 years, he simply stayed, prayed, fasted, was tested, was tempted, was fed by a monk named Romanus, who lowered bread down to him on a rope because there was no path to the cave at all. Benedict did not flee to that cave the way a man flees a burning house, running from something with nowhere particular in mind. He went to it the way a man goes toward a marriage, knowing that he was choosing a life he intended to keep. That instinct to stay, to remain, to let a single place and a single commitment become the crucible of an entire life rather than one stop among many, would become, decades later, one of the 3 vows he wrote into the rule for every monk who would ever follow him. Stability, he called it. Stabilitas. Not the absence of struggle, but the refusal to run from struggle by simply changing location. Benedict had learned in his own body, in that cave above Subiaco, that the temptations a man carries do not stay behind when he moves to a new address. They travel with him. The only way through them is through. And through takes time, takes place, takes staying. Alongside stability, Benedict would come to teach something almost as countercultural, that a life is not converted once and then finished, but converted again and again, day upon day, in a lifelong turning toward God that never quite arrives at its destination this side of the grave. Conversation morum, he called this, an ongoing conversion of manners and life, a continual reorientation that never lets a soul settle into the comfortable lie that it has already become what it needs to become. The boy who fled Rome was not, by that flight alone, made holy. The Benedict who stood at the tower window near the end of his life had been turning toward God in small, unglamorous increments for 60 years, and this turning had a rhythm to it, a daily architecture Benedict would eventually give to every soul who joined him. Ora et labora, prayer and work, the conviction that no hour of a rightly ordered day belongs outside the reach of God, not the hours spent bent over Scripture in the half-dark of the oratory, not the hours spent in the fields or the kitchen or the scriptorium with hands stained and backs aching, every task sanctified. Every hour, from the vigils that had not yet rung on the night of the great vision, to the compline that closed each day in silence, gathered into what Benedict called simply the work of God, the opus Dei, the divine office, the 8 hours of common prayer around which he built the entire architecture of monastic time. A man who prayed like that, day after day, decade after decade, was training his eyes for exactly the moment we began with. He was learning, 1 hour at a time, to see the world the way God sees it, which is to say, to see it as small, held, and entirely within reach of mercy. This is why the vision at the tower window belongs at the very front of this book, rather than tucked away near its end, where the chronology would otherwise place it. It is not simply the most spectacular episode in Benedict's life. It is the interpretive key to every other episode. When you meet the frightened student in Rome a few chapters from now, you will already know where his flight is leading. When you meet the young hermit in the cave, tempted nearly past bearing, you will already know what all that solitude was purchasing. When you meet the abbot at Monte Cassino, building a monastery on the ruins of a pagan temple, facing down jealous rivals, writing a rule so measured and so wise that it would still be forming souls 15 centuries later, you will already know that the wisdom in that rule did not come from a man guessing at holiness. It came from a man who had, by the time he picked up his pen, already learned to see the whole world in a single ray of light. There is one more piece of that night at the tower worth holding close before we move on, and it is easy to miss beneath the wonder of the vision itself. Benedict did not simply have an extraordinary experience and keep it as private consolation. He sent messengers to Capua. He tested what he had seen against the facts of the world, against a bishop's actual death, confirmed by actual travelers who made an actual journey down an actual road. The vision was not a retreat from reality. It was a deeper penetration into it. This is the pattern of the whole Benedictine tradition that would grow from this man. Not escape from the world into some private spiritual comfort, but a way of seeing the world, the real world, with its bishops and roads and messengers and deaths, so clearly, so wholly, that it becomes transparent to the God who holds it. That is the invitation this book carries, and it is worth saying plainly at the outset. You are not being asked, in the pages that follow, to admire a man from a great and comfortable distance, the way one admires a statue or a stained glass window. You are being introduced to a father, because that, finally, is what Benedict became to every soul who has since called itself Benedictine, oblate or monk. And it is what the very first word of his rule calls every reader who dares to pick it up. Listen, the prologue begins. Listen, my son, to the precepts of the Master, and incline the ear of your heart. A father does not perform his holiness at a safe remove. He teaches you to see what he has learned to see, and he does it patiently, over years, the way Benedict himself learned it. 1 hour of prayer, 1 day of labor, 1 act of staying when leaving would have been so much easier at a time. We will go back now to the beginning, to a boy in Rome who wanted, more than anything, to get away from the life laid out for him. But do not lose the image of the tower window as we go. Keep it somewhere behind your eyes. An old monk standing in the dark before the bell, watching the whole world gather itself into a single ray of light, small enough at last to be seen whole, because he had spent a lifetime learning to look for God first, and everything else, in the end, fell into its proper and astonishing scale. The mountains around Nursia stand close together, the way old friends stand at a graveside, near enough to touch, saying nothing. Even now, if you climb into that stretch of the central Apennines the Romans once called the Sabine Highlands, you feel how the peaks crowd the sky, how the light arrives late and leaves early, how the town below sits in a green bowl ringed by stone. It is beautiful country, and it is hard country. Winters come down from the Sibylline range like a judgment. Snow can linger into May. The men of Nursia were known across Italy for two things: the toughness bred into them by that climate, and a stubborn loyalty to the old Roman ways long after Rome itself had stopped deserving it. Into a family of that town, sometime around the year 480, a child was born who would carry both qualities to the end of his life, the toughness and the loyalty, though not to Rome, to something Rome had forgotten how to give. We do not know his father's name. Gregory the Great, writing a century later with the testimony of men who had known Benedict in the flesh, tells us only what mattered to him, that the boy came from parents of good and honorable standing, free-born, the kind of family whose sons were raised for something. In the Italy of that century, raised for something had one clear meaning. It meant Rome. It meant the schools of rhetoric and law that had trained the empire's magistrates and senators for 500 years, schools that still operated, still drew ambitious fathers from the provinces, the way a hearth draws cold hands, even though the empire they had once served in the West had ceased, 4 years before Benedict's birth, to exist at all. That fact is worth sitting with before we go any further, because it shapes everything that follows. In 476, the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus was quietly deposed by a Germanic soldier named Odoacer, and no one troubled to crown a successor. The Western Roman Empire, which had ruled from Britain to North Africa, which had built roads still walked today and laws still read today, simply stopped, not with fire and sack this time. Rome had survived that already, in 410 under Alaric, but with a shrug. A barbarian king now sat where Caesars had sat, and the machinery of empire kept turning for a while out of sheer habit, the way a mill wheel keeps spinning after the water's been diverted, slower each year until it stops. Benedict of Nursia was born into the slowing of that wheel. His parents did not know it was already over. Few people in 480 did. They sent him when he was old enough to be formed for a world that had, in the deepest sense, already ended, and something in that discrepancy between what his family believed they were preparing him for and what actually awaited him would become the central hinge of his life. He was not sent alone into the world, and this matters more than it might seem. Benedict was born with a twin sister, a girl named Scholastica, and from the very first days of their lives, Gregory is precise about this. She had been consecrated to God, not later, not as a young woman choosing between suitors and the veil, but from infancy. She belonged to God the way some children simply belong to the sea or the mountains, before they have words for what has claimed them. We know almost nothing else about her childhood. no anecdote, no miracle, no scene of the two of them as small children in the streets of Nursia. The silence itself tells us something. Whatever passed between brother and sister in those early years passed without incident worth recording. No drama, no conflict, only the quiet fact of two lives running alongside each other from the same womb, one bound eventually for the schools of Rome, the other already, in her heart, bound for God. It would be decades before their paths crossed again, in any way history preserved. But she was there from the beginning, and she would be there again, unforgettably, near the very end. Keep her in mind. This book will return to her. For now, the boy was sent away. We can imagine, cautiously, what that departure looked like, because we know the roads he would have taken and the manner in which families of means traveled them. South from Nursia, down through the Sabine hills, along routes the legions had built and maintained for centuries, roads that were beginning, in places, to show the neglect of an empire with no one left to maintain them. He did not travel alone. No boy of that class did. He had with him a nurse, a devoted servant of the household, whose name and fidelity Gregory preserves for us, because she would matter enormously to the story soon enough. Together they made the journey every ambitious family from the provinces still made in that century, toward Rome and the schools that could still, in theory, turn a mountain boy into a man of law, a man of letters, a man who mattered. What awaited him there was not the Rome of Cicero or Augustus, though the buildings still stood, the Forum, the Colosseum, the great baths, all of it still visible, still walkable, a museum of a civilization that had not yet realized it was dead. The Rome of Benedict's youth was a city living on inheritance rather than income. Its population had collapsed from over 1 million at its height to a fraction of that number. Its aqueducts still ran, mostly. Its senate still met, technically, though it answered now to Odoacer and, soon after, to the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled Italy with a competence that briefly disguised how thoroughly the old order had passed away. The schools Benedict was sent to attend were real schools, teaching real Latin rhetoric and real law, taught by men who took the old curriculum seriously, even as the world around them made that curriculum increasingly beside the point. It was a city of ghosts performing the customs of the living, and it was, by every account that survives, morally rotten in the particular way a declining and crowded city becomes rotten, through the young men gathered there without purpose. Gregory does not linger on details, and neither should we. He tells us plainly that many of the students Benedict found himself among had abandoned themselves to vice, that Rome at that hour offered every occasion for a young man to lose himself entirely, and that this was, in fact, the ordinary experience of youths sent from good families into that particular city at that particular moment. It was not that Rome had always been this way. It was that Rome, stripped of its old civic purpose, had become a city where appetite filled the space discipline used to occupy. The law that had once organized an empire now organized very little. The rhetoric that had once trained senators now trained men for careers that barely existed. What remained, for a young man with money and no fixed star to steer by, was simply the city itself, its pleasures, its idleness, its enormous capacity to let a person disappear. Benedict watched this happen to the boys around him. We do not know how long he endured it. Gregory suggests it was not long, that he withdrew from his studies while still young, before he had gone very far into the course of letters at all. But we know what he saw, because Gregory tells us in a single sentence that has echoed through 15 centuries of readers, that Benedict saw many of his fellow students falling headlong into vice and drew back the foot which he had, as it were, just set forward into the world. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the hinge of this entire chapter, and in some sense the hinge of everything Benedict would become. He had, as it were, just set his foot forward into the world. The phrase implies motion already begun. He was not a boy who never went to Rome, never tried the path his family had chosen for him, never risked anything. He went. He set his foot down on the very threshold his father had raised him to cross, the threshold that led to standing, to a career, to the kind of respectable Roman life a freeborn son of Nursia was supposed to want. And having set that foot down, having felt what the world on the other side of the threshold actually offered, he drew it back. This was not timidity. A timid boy does not withdraw from the schools of Rome and strike out, essentially alone, into an uncertain future with nothing but a nurse for company and no clear destination in mind. A timid boy stays where he is put, keeps his head down, finishes the course, takes the safe position his family arranged. What Benedict did instead took a harder kind of courage. The courage to admit that the path everyone around him considered obviously good was, for him, a road toward ruin, and to walk away from it before it was too late, rather than after. We should be honest about what he gave up, because the honesty is part of what makes the choice mean something. He did not turn away from Rome because he had failed there, or because the doors had closed to him, or because some scandal drove him out. By every indication, he had the birth, the means, and presumably the capacity to succeed in exactly the career his family had marked out: law, rhetoric, a respectable office in a city still clinging to the forms of empire even as the substance drained away. He turned away from a future that was, by every worldly measure, still open to him. This is the pattern Scripture calls conversion, and Benedict himself would later build an entire vow around: conversation morum, the ongoing turning of one's whole life toward God. And here, at the very root of the tree, is its first appearance: a boy in his mid-teens, still practically a child by our reckoning, looking at the corridor of Roman success laid out before him, and choosing, instead, to close the door. What did he actually see that made the choice for him? Gregory does not give us a catalogue of scandalous incidents, and it would be a mistake to invent one. But he gives us something more useful than gossip. He gives us the shape of the temptation. Benedict, still very young, found himself surrounded by classmates for whom the city's freedoms had become a kind of gravity, pulling them steadily downward, and he understood, with a clarity that Gregory attributes to the grace of God working in him even then, that he stood at the edge of the same pull. It was not that he had already fallen. It was that he could see, with unusual precision for someone so young, exactly how falling would happen to him if he stayed. Rome did not need to corrupt him through some single dramatic event. It would have corrupted him the way it corrupted everyone else in that company, gradually, sociably, one compromise following naturally from the last, until the boy who left Nursia with his family's hopes fastened to him arrived, years later, at a destination none of them would have recognized as success. He would not permit that gradual arrival, and here we meet, for the first time, the man he would become, the same man who would later write, in the prologue to his rule, of running while there is still light, of not delaying conversion, of the narrow way that leads to life. The theology of the rule did not descend on Benedict fully formed at Monte Cassino 60 years later. It was forged, link by link, in decisions like this one. A decision made not by a wise abbot with decades of discernment behind him, but by a teenage boy standing in the middle of the greatest city he had ever seen, terrified of what it was quietly asking him to become. Frightened is, in fact, the right word, and it is worth defending it against the temptation to make Benedict sound more serene than he was at this stage of his life. He was not yet the man who could sit unmoved through years of solitude, who could face down a would-be poisoner with a calm blessing, who could speak to kings without flinching. He was a boy from a mountain town, raised on cold air and old loyalties, dropped into the largest and most morally exhausted city in the Western world. And what he felt there, watching classmates he presumably knew by name slide into ruin around him, was fear. Fear that the same current would take him. Fear, perhaps, of disappointing the family who had sent him with such hope. Fear, certainly, of a future he could see clearly enough to dread. Gregory's account gives us a young man acting not from icy resolve, but from something closer to holy alarm, the instinct of someone who feels the ground shifting under him and moves fast before it gives way entirely. So he left. He turned his back on Rome, on the schools, on the career, on every worldly advantage his birth had purchased for him, and he did it, as far as the record shows, without a plan for what would come next beyond the certainty of what he was fleeing. His old nurse went with him, unwilling to abandon the boy in her charge to whatever uncertain road lay ahead. Behind them, the city of the Caesars kept performing its dwindling rituals, its senate still convening in a shrunken form, its law schools still teaching a legal code that would soon enough belong entirely to history and not at all to the present. Ahead of Benedict lay the Sabine Hills again, a small town called Enfidei. And, though neither he nor his nurse could have known it yet, the beginning of everything the Church would come to call, simply, the rule of Saint Benedict. He did not know, walking out of Rome, that he was walking toward a cave above a lake, toward 3 years of silence that would break and remake him, toward 12 monasteries and 1 great mountain, and a document that would outlive every empire that came after the one collapsing quietly behind him. He knew only what every person who has ever made a true conversion knows in the moment of making it. Not where the new road leads, only that the old one led somewhere he could not follow it and remain himself. That is the whole of what he carried out of Nursia's shadow and into Rome's, and out of Rome's shadow again into the light of the hills. Not a plan, not a vision, only the drawn-back foot and the fear that made him draw it. And, though he could not have named it yet, the grace already at work beneath the fear, turning a frightened boy into the first stone of a foundation that has not stopped being built upon since. The road out of Enfidei climbs before it falls. And then it falls hard. A man walking it in the year 500 would leave behind the little town where the townsfolk had already begun to whisper about the broken sieve made whole again in his hands. A miracle so small and so complete that it frightened him more than it delighted anyone else. He had come to Enfidei to escape Rome. Now Enfidei wanted to make him a wonder worker before he had made himself a monk. So he did what he would do again and again across the whole of his life whenever the world pressed its praise too close. He went further in, not backward, toward the city and its comforts. Further in, toward the silence. The place he found waited above a valley cut by the river Anio, where the Emperor Nero had once dammed the water into 3 broad lakes for pleasure boats and marble terraces, the ruins of which still stood half swallowed by scrub and vine. Above those ruins the mountain rose in gray shelves of limestone, and cut into one shelf, reachable only by a track that a careless foot could lose in an afternoon, was a cave. Later ages would give it a name that has never once needed changing. Sacro Specco, the sacred cave. In the year 500 it had no name at all. It was simply a hole in a cliff, dry, cold, facing north where the sun rarely reached it, and utterly unknown to anyone who might come looking for a young man fleeing his own miracles. Benedict did not find it alone. This is worth pausing on, because the memory of Benedict most readers carry. The solitary in the desert, answerable to no one, needs correcting almost as soon as it forms. He did not walk into that darkness by his own reckoning of the terrain. He was led. On the path near Subiaco he met a monk named Romanus, who belonged to a small monastery perched somewhere on the heights above, under an abbot whose household kept the old discipline of prayer and labor that the region's monasteries still preserved in these unsettled decades after Rome's collapse. Gregory the Great, writing the only record we have of these years, tells us plainly what passed between them. Romanus asked the young stranger what he sought, and hearing his answer, the desire to live for God alone, hidden from every eye but God's, Romanus did not try to talk him out of it. He gave him the monastic habit, the first habit Benedict ever wore, and he showed him the cave, and he made him a promise. He would keep the secret, he would come back. This is the first hinge of the whole Benedictine story, and it turns so quietly that a hurried reader could miss it entirely. Everything that follows, Subiaco's 12 monasteries, Monte Cassino, the rule itself with its sober architecture of common life, begins with one monk choosing to trust another monk's discretion, and one young man choosing to trust an older monk's care. Benedict did not invent solitude for himself. He was given it by a brother who understood that some vocations need cover before they can bear light. Romanus kept his word for 3 years. Every day, or as often as his own monastery's rule and his abbot's patience allowed, Romanus carried bread up from his own portion. Gregory is specific that it came from his own share, not from the common stores, since feeding a hidden hermit was not yet something his abbot had sanctioned, and made his way along the cliff to a spot above the cave where no path led down. There was no way to climb to Benedict without being seen from the monastery below, so Romanus lowered the bread instead, on a long rope over the rock face. And because the cave lay in shadow, and Benedict could not always see or hear a monk moving on the ledge above him, Romanus tied a small bell to the rope. When the bell rang, Benedict knew the bread had come, and he would come out from the dark to draw it up. Picture that bell for a moment, because it is one of the most tender details the whole tradition hands us. A boy who had walked away from every comfort Rome and Nursia together could offer him, from his father's household, from the schools, from the crowd that would have made him a Roman gentleman of consequence, depended for 3 years on the sound of a small bell struck by another man's hand, so that he would know he was not forgotten. Stability does not mean isolation. Even in the depth of the cave, Benedict's life was held up by someone else's faithfulness. And there is a strange, almost unbearable detail that follows the bell, which Gregory records without softening it. The enemy of every good work, envious of the charity between the 2 men, one day threw a stone that struck and broke the bell as the bread was being lowered. Whether we read this as the devil's own hand, or simply as the ancient way of naming every hindrance that rises against a holy purpose, the meaning holds steady either way. Even the smallest, gentlest lines of grace draw opposition. A rope and a bell should have been beneath anyone's notice. They were not beneath the enemy's notice. Romanus did not stop coming. He found other ways to signal his approach, and the bread kept descending, broken bell or not. 3 years is a long time to live in a cave above a gorge, with almost no human contact beyond a rope let down from a cliff. It is long enough to break a man, or to remake him entirely. And which of the two happens depends on very little except whether he has anything, or anyone, to hold on to in the dark. Benedict had the Psalms, which he would have known by heart from his years at Nursia and his unfinished schooling in Rome. He had the silence, which does not comfort a soul so much as it strips a soul, showing him exactly what he is made of, once every distraction has been taken away. And he had, whether he could feel it in any given hour or not, the God he had come there to find. It was not an easy 3 years. Gregory tells us of one struggle in particular that has become, over 15 centuries, one of the most quoted moments in the entire life, not because it flatters Benedict, but because it does the opposite. It shows him nearly undone. The memory came to him, as memories do in silence when there is nothing to drown them out, of a woman he had once seen in Rome. It was not a memory he had gone looking for. It rose in him with what Gregory calls a violence of desire, so fierce that the young hermit came within a breath of abandoning the wilderness altogether and going back to the life he had renounced. This is not a detail the tradition hides or apologizes for. It is told because it is true to every soul that has ever attempted a life of prayer, and because what Benedict did next matters more than the fact that the temptation came at all. Nearby the cave grew a thick tangle of briars and nettles. Benedict tore off his habit and threw himself into the thorns, rolling in them until his whole body bled, until the pain of the flesh overmastered the fire of the memory, and left him, in Gregory's words, healed of the wound within by the wounds he had taken without. He did not flee the temptation by leaving the cave. He met it inside the cave, with his own body as the instrument, and he came out the other side of it, a man who would never again, so far as the record shows us, need to fight that particular battle in that particular way. Later brothers who visited the spot, and pilgrims who visit it still, found rose bushes growing where the briars had once torn him, as though the very ground had taken his suffering and turned it, patiently, into something that could bloom. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this story as though it were only about willpower, a strong young man conquering a weak impulse through sheer force of discipline. That is not quite what happened, and it is not what the tradition asks us to see. What Benedict did in the thorns was not an act of self-reliance. It was an act of desperation offered to God, the last resort of a man who had nothing left to fight with, except his own body and his own will, thrown wholly into the balance because there was no other weapon in the cave. Conversation morum, that ongoing, unfinished conversion the rule would later ask of every monk who came after him, was not something Benedict wrote about from a safe distance. He lived it first in blood and thorns, alone, with no one to see it but God, and, later, whichever brothers of Subiaco he trusted enough to tell. The cave did other work on him too. Quieter work, the kind that does not make for dramatic telling, but that shaped the abbot he would become far more than any single crisis did. 3 years of near total silence teach a man things that no schoolroom in Rome could have taught him. They teach him the actual weight of an hour, how long a single hour of darkness can stretch when there is no office to keep it, and how, once a man begins praying through that same hour day after day, it stops stretching and starts to have a shape, a rhythm, almost a face. Long before Benedict ever wrote a single line prescribing the hours of vigils and lauds and compline for other men to keep, he had already discovered in his own body what an ordered day of prayer does for a soul left otherwise unmoored. Ora et labora, did not arrive to him first as a sentence in a rule book. It arrived as the plain, hard necessity of a man in a cave who had to decide, morning after morning, what he would do with the hours God kept giving him, and who found that psalm and stillness, and whatever small manual labor the cave allowed, weaving perhaps or simple mending, held him together in a way that idleness never could have. He was not entirely without human company in those years, though for most of them Romanus was the only soul who knew he existed. Near the end of his time in the cave, shepherds working the slopes above Subiaco stumbled on him by accident. Gregory tells us they mistook him at first for a wild animal, his hair long and matted, his clothing whatever skins or ruined habit still covered him, his frame reduced by years of fasting to something that no longer looked entirely like a man of the world they knew. When they came close enough to see he was no beast but a hermit, deep in prayer, their fear turned to reverence, and the encounter turned Benedict, almost against his will, into something the cave alone could never have made him known. The shepherds began to bring him food of their own, and in exchange, Gregory says, he began to instruct them in the things of God, the first teaching of the man who would one day shape the prayer life of the whole Western Church, offered not from a pulpit or an abbot's chair, but from the mouth of a cave, to men who tended sheep for a living and had stumbled on a saint by accident. There is one more story from these years that deserves its place here, small as it is, because it shows so plainly the kind of God Benedict had come into the wilderness to find. On an Easter day, a priest living some distance away had prepared a fine meal to celebrate the feast, and as he sat down to it, he heard, in prayer, or in a dream, Gregory does not press us to decide which, a voice telling him that while he feasted, a servant of God nearby was suffering hunger. The priest went out searching, and eventually found Benedict in his cave. "Let us give thanks to God together," Benedict said, when the priest explained why he had come. "For it is Easter," the priest gently corrected him. Benedict, in his solitude, had lost track of the calendar entirely, and did not know that the feast had already come. They ate together, the two of them, in the cave that had held nothing but silence for years. And then the priest went back down the mountain, and Benedict returned to his solitude richer for having been remembered. That is the shape of these 3 years, taken all together, a man given over entirely to God in a hidden, difficult place, sustained the whole time not by his own strength alone, but by a rope and a bell, a shepherd's curiosity, a priest's obedience to a strange prompting, and underneath every one of those, the steady, unspectacular faithfulness of Romanus, who never once stopped climbing the cliff. Benedict went into Sacro Specco, a frightened young man, running from a city, and, more quietly, from a small miracle he did not know how to carry. He came out of it an abbot before he had a single monk to govern. Tested in his body, tested in his memory, tested in his patience for the long hours of an ordinary day, lived toward God and nothing else. Every later chapter of his life, the founding of the 12 monasteries at Subiaco, the long walk to Monte Cassino, the 73 chapters of a rule that has outlasted every empire that rose in its shadow, rests on what those 3 dark years quietly built in him. He did not stay in the cave forever, but everything he built afterward, he built with what the cave had made of him. The old abbot of Vicovaro was buried in early spring, and before the earth had properly settled over him, his monks were climbing the mountain path to Subiaco. They came in a small delegation, out of breath from the ascent, dust on their sandals from the road that wound along the Anio. They had heard, as everyone in that country had heard by now, of the young man in the cave, the hermit whose holiness had outgrown his hiding place, who healed and taught and drew the shepherds down from their flocks to kneel at the mouth of a hole in the rock. They had a monastery without a father. They believed they had found one. Benedict was perhaps 30 years old. 3 winters in the dark had done their work on him, stripped him, as we saw, of the vanity that once made a boy love the sound of his own cleverness, and left in its place something harder to name. A stillness that did not flinch, a gaze that seemed to see past the visible person into the soul standing behind it. The monks of Vicovaro knelt before him in the narrow space outside the cave and asked him to be their abbot. He said no. He said no plainly, and he said it more than once. It is worth pausing on this refusal, because it tells us something essential about the man the rule would later call, of all abbots, the one who must hold the place of Christ. Benedict did not want authority. He had fled Rome precisely to escape the arrangements of power, the flattery, the maneuvering, the exhausting theater of men managing other men. He had gone into the earth to be alone with God. And God, as far as Benedict could tell, had not yet released him from that solitude. He told the monks, with the directness that would mark every later dealing he had with anyone, that his way of life and theirs would not agree, that he was a hard man to live under, and they would not be able to bear him. They did not believe him, or perhaps they believed him, and thought they wanted hardness, thought, in the way of communities grown slack, that what they lacked was exactly the rigor they imagined a hermit must carry down from his cave like a gift. They pressed. They would not leave. Gregory tells us they kept at it until Benedict, worn down not by argument, but by their sheer persistence, agreed to go with them. We should notice this about Benedict before we go further. He was not a man easily moved by pleading, but he was a man who could be moved by need honestly presented. He had refused the honor of Rome without a second thought. He accepted the burden of Vicovaro only because men in front of him, again and again, said they needed a father and had none. That distinction, honor refused, need answered, is the seed of everything his fatherhood would become. So he left the cave that had sheltered him and walked down into the valley, into a monastery with walls and a refectory and a rule of life already old before he arrived, to be abbot of men who did not yet know what they had asked for. It went badly almost at once. Vicovaro's monks had grown comfortable in the way communities grow comfortable when no one has held them to anything for a long time. The old abbot, whoever he was, had let slide what should not have been let slide: the small compromises, the private stores of food, the whispered exceptions each brother made for himself until the whole house ran on exceptions and nothing else. Into this arrangement came a man who had spent 3 years eating what a rope lowered to him, praying through nights that had no morning in sight, wrestling temptation in a thicket of briars until his own blood ran. Benedict did not know how to be lax. He would not have known where to begin. When he set the community back onto the narrow path, regular hours, common discipline, the small daily deaths that monastic life asks of a man who would rather sleep, rather eat more, rather keep for himself what belongs to all, the monks of Vicovaro discovered exactly what he had warned them of. They could not bear him. They complained first. Complaint, in a monastery as anywhere else, is often the last stop before something worse, and Vicovaro did not stop there. The brothers began to meet in corners, the way men meet when they have decided together on something they are ashamed to do alone. What they decided was this, that they would be rid of their abbot, and that poison would do it. Gregory of the Dialogues, who preserved this story for us across the centuries, with the plain confidence of a man recording what he had been told by those who remembered, says the monks put poison into the wine set aside for Benedict's table. It was the custom, as it remains the custom in religious houses, that the abbot blessed the cup before it was shared. Benedict, seated at table, made the sign of the cross over the poisoned vessel as he had made it over every cup of his life, without suspicion, without drama, simply as a man who blesses what is set before him, because blessing what is set before him is what a Christian does. The glass shattered in his hand. It broke, Gregory tells us, as though struck by a stone, though no stone had touched it. Shattered under the sign of the cross the way ice shatters under a sudden frost, all at once, entirely, leaving Benedict holding nothing but shards and a stain spreading across the table linen. He did not need an explanation. He looked at the ruin of the cup and understood exactly what his own community had prepared for him. He did not rage. This matters as much as the miracle itself. A lesser man, discovering that the brothers he had left his solitude to serve had plotted his death, might have answered with severity, might have demanded confession and punishment, might at the very least have let his hurt show. Benedict rose from the table instead and looked, we are told, not with fury, but with something closer to sorrow, at the men gathered around him, men he had been sent to father, men who had begged him down from his mountain and now wanted him dead rather than governed. And he spoke to them the words that have been carried down through 15 centuries of monks copying and recopying Gregory's account, words that catch, better than any commentary could, exactly who Benedict was at the center of himself. Almighty God, have mercy on you and forgive you. Why have you sought to do this thing to me? Did I not tell you beforehand that my manner of living would never accord with yours? Go and find yourselves an abbot suited to your ways. As for me, you shall have me no longer. And he left them. He walked back out of the valley, back up toward Subiaco, back, we might think, toward the cave, toward the silence that had never once tried to kill him. There is a temptation, hearing this story, to treat it as a footnote, a strange, almost folkloric interlude before the real founding work begins, the kind of miracle tale that later ages love to attach to a saint's early years. I would ask you to resist that temptation. This episode is not a footnote. It is the hinge on which Benedict's whole understanding of authority turns. He had gone to Vicovaro believing, or half-believing, that holiness alone might be enough to govern men, that a man who had wrestled his own demons in the dark could simply walk into a house of monks and set it right by the force of what he had already become. Vicovaro taught him otherwise. It taught him that fatherhood is not a possession one carries down from a mountain. It is a relationship built slowly, consented to on both sides, and capable of being refused, resisted, even poisoned by those who have not yet chosen to receive it. Everything the rule would later say about the abbot, that he must be chosen by his community, that he must give an account for every soul entrusted to him, that authority is a burden of love and not a throne, has its root in this failure at Vicovaro. Benedict did not learn fatherhood from success. He learned its true weight from the cup that shattered in his hand. He returned to Subiaco changed once more, though not in the way 3 years in a cave had changed him. That first transformation had been the stripping away of a young man's pride. This one was the beginning of wisdom about other men, about how slowly trust must be built, how easily it can be poisoned, how a shepherd's love must be patient enough to survive even the flock's own hand raised against him. And here the strange mercy of God's timing becomes visible, because it was precisely now, with the wound of Vicovaro still fresh, that men began arriving at Subiaco in numbers Benedict could not have anticipated. Word of the hermit's holiness had spread while he was away, being nearly murdered by the very monks who sought it out. And now, upon his return, The trickle of visitors that had once brought bread and questions to the cave's edge became something closer to a stream. Men came from the towns of the Sabine Hills, from families of some standing and families of none. Young men and men already advanced in years, drawn by what they had heard, that here, above the green gorge of the Anio, lived a man who had wrestled the desert's temptations and won, who spoke of God the way other men spoke of the weather, as a plain and constant fact of the day. They did not come to visit, they came to stay. This is one of the quiet marvels of Benedict's story, easy to pass over if we are hurrying toward Monte Cassino, but essential if we want to understand the shape his fatherhood first took. He did not advertise, he did not send for disciples or build a reputation the way a teacher builds a school. He simply lived, prayed the hours, worked with his hands, kept the discipline he had learned in the dark, and men recognized in that steady, unhurried life something they were hungry for, and had not found in the churches or the villas or the collapsing institutions of a Roman world that no longer knew how to hold itself together. Subiaco in those years was becoming, without anyone planning it, one of the first true monastic settlements of the West. Not a single great house, but something more organic and, in the end, more Benedictine. A scattering of small communities growing up around a father who had never asked to be one. The numbers, as they grew, presented Benedict with a practical problem, and it is here that we see the administrator emerging alongside the mystic, a pairing that would define him for the rest of his life. A single monastery, however large, is not simply doubled or tripled by adding more monks to its dormitory. Past a certain size, a community loses the thing that makes it a family and becomes instead a crowd, ruled by regulation rather than known by name. Benedict, remembering perhaps the very failure that had nearly killed him at Vicovaro, a community too large or too settled in its ways for one father to truly reach every son, chose a different design entirely. He built 12 monasteries. Each held 12 monks, a number that could not have been accidental to a man so steeped in Scripture. 12 apostles gathered around the one teacher, 12 small households scattered across the hillside, like a constellation of the gospel itself, each little community complete in miniature, each capable of knowing its own members by face and failing and grace. Over each monastery Benedict placed a dean, a monk of proven steadiness, charged with the daily governance of his small flock, answerable in turn to Benedict himself, who remained the father of the whole family, though he lived in none of the 12 houses alone. It was, and here we can see the rule already forming, decades before it was written down, an architecture of fatherhood that could scale without losing its warmth, authority delegated but never abandoned, oversight without smothering, each community small enough that no monk within it could become invisible to the men praying beside him. Benedict kept a small number of disciples with him directly, a handful chosen not for rank but for the particular work of formation, the men he would train most closely, in whom he invested the fullest measure of what 3 years in the dark and 1 catastrophic season at Vicovaro had taught him. Among this circle, tradition remembers names that would matter for the whole of Benedictine history, men who would carry his charism forward long after Subiaco itself had become a memory folded into something larger. But the substance of the work in these years was not any single disciple. It was the pattern itself, 12 houses, 12 monks each, a valley transformed within a single generation, from a hermit's solitary wilderness into a working landscape of prayer. And prayer, we must be clear, was only half of it. These were not contemplatives idling in the Italian sun. The monks of Subiaco's 12 monasteries tilled what ground could be tilled on that steep hillside, drew water, built and repaired the simple stone structures that housed them, kept the hours of the office as best their still-forming customs allowed, and labored in the fields and gardens with the same seriousness they brought to the psalms. Ora et labora was not yet a phrase Benedict had written down. The rule itself lay decades in the future, but it was already the rhythm his community breathed, prayer and work folded into a single unbroken day, because that was the rhythm Benedict himself had lived since the moment Romanus first lowered bread to him on a rope. He was not inventing a theology of time. He was extending into 12 small houses of consenting men the pattern God had already carved into him alone in the dark. It would be pleasant to say that Subiaco's years unfolded afterward in unbroken peace, that having survived Vicovoro's poison, Benedict met no further malice, and the 12 monasteries grew quietly toward the greater founding still to come. That is not, in fact, how the story goes, and we will have occasion later to see the shadow that eventually fell across this valley and drove Benedict from it. But that trial belongs to its own chapter. What belongs to this one is simpler, and in its way more remarkable. A man who had refused every offer of worldly advancement, who had been nearly murdered by the first community that begged for his leadership, chose, not out of ambition, not out of any desire to be seen or followed, to become a father after all. 12 times over, on a hillside above a river, in stone houses built by the very hands that prayed in them, Benedict became abbot. Not the title Rome would have given him, not the honor his family in Nursia might once have hoped for, but the one fatherhood he had been formed, through darkness and betrayal both, to bear. He had gone into the cave to escape being anyone's father. He came out of these years having become, almost without noticing the moment it happened, father to more souls than he could count on both hands. The road south, in the year 529, was not an easy one, and Benedict did not walk it lightly. Behind him lay Subiaco, the cave, the 12 small monasteries he had raised along the green shoulders of the Anio Valley, the disciples he had gathered and formed and now, painfully, was leaving in the hands of priors he trusted to hold what he had built. Ahead lay a mountain he had likely never seen, rising above a half-ruined Roman town called Casinum, in a province he did not know. He walked it anyway, with a small company of chosen monks, because staying had become impossible. The trouble had a name, Florentius, a priest of the district, envious of the reputation Benedict's community had earned. The crowds who came seeking counsel, the miracles whispered from village to village. Florentius had first tried poison, sending a loaf of bread laced to kill, and watched a raven Benedict kept carry it away at his word. Failing that, he tried something crueler and harder to defend against. He sent 7 young women into the garden of Benedict's monastery to dance and sing before the brothers until the peace of the place was shattered, and the temptation of the flesh set loose among men who had given their lives to chastity. It was not the monk's virtue Benedict doubted. It was the wisdom of remaining where one man's malice could keep finding new ways to wound a community he had spent years shaping into something whole. Rather than fight Florentius, rather than expose his sons to a war of attrition against a hatred that would not exhaust itself, Benedict chose to leave. He set priors over the 12 monasteries, gathered a handful of monks around him, and turned his face south. He had not gone far when a monk named Maurus came running after him, breathless, glad. Florentius was dead, killed when the balcony on which he stood to watch the departing company collapsed beneath him. Maurus brought the news as good news, the kind a loyal disciple brings gladly to a father who has been wronged. Benedict did not receive it that way. He wept. He wept for Florentius, a man who had died with such hatred unresolved in his heart. And he laid a penance on Morris for having rejoiced at another man's death and another man's damnation. It tells you something about the sort of abbot Benedict had already become, even in leaving, even in defeat. For that is what it must have felt like, walking away from 12 monasteries he had built with his own hands. He did not walk away angry. He walked away grieving for the man who had driven him out, more than for himself. The mountain, when he reached it, was not empty ground waiting to be claimed. It was Monte Cassino, and it belonged, as far as the people of that country understood the word, to Apollo. Cassinum below had been a Roman town of some consequence once, with a theater and an amphitheater whose stones still stood, weathering slowly under Italian sun. Above it, the mountain climbed steep and commanding, and on its summit the old religion had left its mark centuries deep. A temple to Apollo, an altar, and around them a grove considered sacred, where the country people still came to make their offerings. This was 529, nearly 2 centuries after Constantine, more than a century after Rome itself had a Christian emperor. And still, on that hilltop, the rustic families of the district gathered to sacrifice to a god their grandfathers' grandfathers had worshipped, because that is how deeply the old ways root themselves, and how slowly they yield, in the villages and hill country far from the cities, where councils meet and edicts are signed. Christianity had conquered Rome's palaces long before it conquered Rome's fields. Benedict did not come to that mountain as a conqueror with fire and sword, however the moment might be pictured by someone imagining it from a distance. He came the way he had always come to difficult things, slowly, and by staying. He preached to the people of the district, patiently, over time, the way a man plants who expects to be there for the harvest. He did not shout down their father's religion from a safe distance. He lived among them, in the shadow of the very shrine they still tended, and let them watch a different kind of life take shape, day by day, at the top of their mountain. Conversions came, not all at once, not the whole district in a season, but steadily, family by family, until Benedict judged that enough hearts had turned, that the old altar could be answered, rather than merely ignored. Then, with those who had come to faith standing beside him, he acted. The idol of Apollo was broken. The altar where the offerings had smoked for generations was overturned. The grove that had stood sacred to the old god, shading the hilltop with the same trees that had shaded it in the days when Rome itself still burned incense to 100 gods, was cut down. Where the temple had stood, Benedict raised an oratory to Saint Martin of Tours, a saint who had, in his own century, broken his own share of pagan shrines in Gaul, and so was a fitting patron for ground reclaimed the same way. Where the altar had stood, he raised a second oratory to John the Baptist, the voice crying in the wilderness, the one who had prepared a way in a desert no less stubborn than that mountain stone. 2 small buildings, roughly made in those first months, replacing what centuries of custom had never quite been able to displace. The hill that had known only Apollo now had 2 other names carved into its silence. What followed was not a single dramatic act, but years of ordinary, exhausting work. And this is the part of the story that asks the most patience from us, precisely because it asked the most patience from Benedict and the men who climbed that mountain with him. A monastery does not spring up because a shrine has been broken. Someone has to clear the ground of centuries of debris and undergrowth. Someone has to find the stone, quarry it, haul it up a mountainside with no road built for the purpose, and set it course by course into walls that will still be standing when the men who raised them are dust. Someone has to dig for water, plan for winter, Build a kitchen that will not burn the first time a fire is lit carelessly in it. Lay out a garden that can feed 40 or 50 mouths through a season when nothing else arrives. Benedict did this work, not oversaw it from a chair, did it with his hands, alongside the brothers who had followed him from Subiaco and the new men the district began to send him as the community's reputation for holiness spread through the valley below. This is ora et labora in its rawest, least sentimental form, not the tidy motto it becomes on a plaque above a cloister door, but blistered hands and aching backs and the long patience of building something that will outlast the builder. Every stone set into those walls was a kind of prayer, not because Benedict thought of masonry as mystical, but because he had already decided, years before, in the cave above Subiaco, that no hour of a life belongs outside of God's claim on it. The hours spent hauling rock were not interruptions to the life of prayer. They were the life of prayer extended into forearms and shoulders, and the ache of a body given entirely to a work it did not choose for comfort. It was not easy work, and Gregory the Great, writing the account of Benedict's life a lifetime later from the testimony of men who had known him, preserved a memory of just how much resistance the mountain itself seemed to offer, resistance that the tradition does not hesitate to name for what the brothers believed it was. There is a stone remembered from those years, one the community needed for the building and could not move. Not a few men straining and failing, the whole company of brothers together, pulling and pushing, and finally simply standing around it exhausted, unable to shift it an inch, as though the stone had rooted itself into the mountain and meant to stay there until judgment. Word reached Benedict of what was happening, and he came down to see it for himself. He looked at the stone, and where his monks had seen only dead weight, he saw something else entirely. He made the sign of the cross over it, and asked a blessing on the work, and the brothers who had failed to budge it now lifted it, as though it weighed nothing at all. The tradition remembers this not as parlor magic, but as plain testimony, that the ground beneath Monte Cassino did not surrender easily, that something had been sitting on that stone besides moss and mountain dust, and that it yielded only when Benedict called on an authority higher than his own strength or his monks' combined labor. The building of a monastery on a hill that had belonged to Apollo for centuries was never going to be uncontested ground. Benedict seems to have understood that going in, and to have met each resistance the same unhurried way he met everything, not with panic, not with theatrics, but with prayer offered plainly, and then the work resumed. Slowly the mountain changed shape beneath the community's hands. Cells rose where undergrowth had been. A church took form where the temple's rubble had lain scattered. A wall began to enclose the whole summit, marking off in stone the same boundary Benedict had already drawn in his own heart at Subiaco. This ground, this place, this particular community of particular men, and no other. No restless search for a better site down the valley, or a more impressive peak further south. Stability was not a word yet when Benedict began building at Monte Cassino. Not a vow codified into 73 chapters and a prologue. But it was already the shape his whole life had taken, from the moment he turned back from Rome as a young man, to the moment he chose this one hilltop and did not leave it again for the rest of his days. He had fled a city, fled a monastery of would-be poisoners, fled the malice of Florentius, but notice what he never fled: the discipline of staying. Once he judged a place was where God meant him to remain. Monte Cassino would be the last flight. Everything after this belonged to one mountain, one community, one rule, slowly taking shape in the quiet hours between labor and the hours of the office. The men who climbed that mountain with him were not building for themselves alone, though none of them, hauling stone in the heat of an Italian summer, could have known what the work would become. They could not have known that the small oratories raised on the bones of Apollo's temple would still be standing, in one form or another, 15 centuries later. They could not have known that the discipline they were learning in those years, rise before dawn, pray the hours, labor with the hands, read in silence, eat together, sleep, and begin again, would be written down by the man leading them and handed to the whole of the Western Church as a map for how to live. They knew only what anyone building anything knows, that the wall in front of them needed another course of stone before nightfall, that the garden needed turning before the season changed, that the man beside them was tired in the same way they were tired, and that somehow, in the middle of all that ordinary exhaustion, something was taking root that felt larger than the work itself. Rome's empire in the West was, by then, already gone in every way that mattered. The last emperor deposed more than 50 years before, the old structures of law and governance and learning collapsing, or already collapsed across a continent sliding into a darkness few men of that generation could see the far edge of. Apollo's temple on that hilltop had stood, in its way, as a monument to a world that believed itself permanent and had already proven it was not. Benedict raised, on its ruins, a monastery built by men who owned nothing, who expected the world around them to keep crumbling, who had no reason to believe their small community would outlast the political order collapsing beneath it. And it did. It has. The empire that built the temple to Apollo is a subject for history books now, footnoted and mourned by scholars. The monastery built from its broken stones has never in 1500 years entirely gone silent. None of that could be seen from the mountain in 529. What could be seen was a hillside cleared of grove and altar, 2 small oratories standing where an old god's shrine had stood, and a community of tired, faithful men going on with the next day's work, because the next day's work was, itself, the whole of the point. Benedict had come south with nothing but a handful of monks and a wound from Subiaco he would carry the rest of his life. He left the mountain a monastery. He would spend the remainder of his years there, never again seeking another cave, another hill, another fresh start, because he had, at last, found the ground he was not going to leave, and had begun, stone by stone, to build something worth staying for. Listen. That is the first word of the rule. Not a title, not a preamble, not a throat-clearing gesture toward the importance of what follows. Ausculta, O fili, listen, my son, to the precepts of the Master, and incline the ear of your heart. Before Benedict tells you anything, he asks you to be quiet enough to hear it. He had learned that lesson himself in a cave above Subiaco, in the dark, for 3 years, before he ever had anything to say. By the time he set down these words at Monte Cassino, sometime around the year 540, Benedict was no longer a young man fleeing Rome. He was old enough to have buried friends, old enough to have been poisoned by monks who wanted an easier master, old enough to have watched a mountain's pagan altar come down stone by stone and a cross go up in its place. 73 short chapters and a prologue. That is all the rule is in its bones. You could read the whole of it in an evening. Men have spent their whole lives inside it and still felt, at the end, that they had only begun. What makes it different from every other monastic rule written before it? And there were others, older ones, some of them Benedict clearly knew and used, is that nothing in it is theoretical. He is not imagining what a monastery should be. He is remembering what one very nearly was not, and writing down, with the plainness of a man who has no more patience for illusions, what it takes to make community survive contact with real human beings. Every chapter has a face behind it, even where he never names the face. When he warns against the abbot who plays favorites, you can hear Vicovaro underneath it, and the men who wanted a master they could ignore. When he insists that no one enter religious life too quickly, that a novice be tested and tested again before profession, you can hear his own 3 years of testing in the cave, the slow, patient work Romanus did in lowering bread on a rope before anyone else knew Benedict existed at all. The rule reads like law, only if you have not lived the life first. Read again, knowing the man, and it reads like a confession. The heartbeat underneath all 73 chapters is the rhythm Benedict had already been living for decades before he wrote a word of it down. Ora et labora, pray and work. Not prayer as a pause between the important tasks of the day, and not work as a necessary evil to be endured until the next office bell. In the world Benedict grew up in, the two were kept in separate rooms. Prayer belonged to the temple, to the priesthood, to the sacred. Work belonged to slaves and tradesmen, to the sweat of ordinary survival. The Roman world he fled had never seriously entertained the idea that a man hoeing a garden or copying a manuscript might be doing something as holy as a man on his knees. Benedict entertained it completely. In the rule, the two are woven so tightly that you cannot say where one ends and the other begins. The monk who prays the hours and refuses honest labor is only half a monk. The monk who labors from dawn to dusk and never lifts his heart to God has missed the entire point of the labor. Every hour of the day in Benedict's ordering belongs to God, not symbolically, but in fact, scheduled, structured, defended against the encroachments of idleness and the false urgencies that eat a life alive. This is not a policy Benedict arrived at by study. It is the distillation of a cave where the only two activities available to him were silence before God and the labor of survival. And he had learned, alone, that neither one without the other could hold a soul together for long. If ora et labora is the rhythm of the rule, the ladder of humility is its spine. Chapter 7, the longest chapter Benedict wrote, longer than his instructions on food, longer than his instructions on discipline, longer than almost anything else in the whole document, describes 12 steps downward before a soul can rise. He borrows the image from the ladder Jacob saw at Bethel, its foot planted on the earth and its top reaching heaven, angels moving upon it. But where Jacob's ladder was ascended, Benedict's must first be descended. The monk climbs toward God by going down, down through the fear of God, down through the surrender of his own will, down through obedience even in hard and unpleasant things, down through patience under the trials that obedience brings, down through confession of the sins and faults hidden in the heart, down through contentment with the lowest and most menial treatment, down through the quiet conviction that he is inferior to all, down through restraint of speech, down through gravity and few words, down through a face that does not need to laugh to prove it is at peace, down through humility that shows itself even in the way a man walks and stands, until, at the 12th and final step, he has become so thoroughly emptied of self-importance that humility is no longer something he practices, but something he simply is, the way water is simply wet. Read that ladder as an idea, and it can sound like spiritual athletics, a discipline for the very devout. Read it against the shape of Benedict's own life, and it becomes something else entirely, a map of the ground he had already covered. The boy who left Rome left behind exactly the kind of ambition the first steps of the ladder ask a monk to renounce. The disciplines Benedict names were not abstractions to him. They were the actual road he had walked from a frightened boy in a rich family's house to a hermit fed by a stranger's charity. The hermit who let Romanus lower bread to him on a rope, unable to provide for himself, had already descended through steps that most spiritual writers only theorize about. The abbot who returned to Vicovoro's poisoned wine and forgave the men who tried to kill him had already climbed past the step that asks a man to bear injury without complaint. When Benedict writes that the monk must consider himself inferior to all and hold his tongue until asked to speak, he is not inventing a discipline for others to attempt. He is describing, in the plain second person of instruction, the path his own soul had already walked in the dark, alone, with no one watching, and no reward in sight except the possibility that God was, in fact, listening. This is why the rule never feels like it is scolding you from a distance. It feels like a father sitting across the table, describing a road he has walked himself, telling you honestly what the going is like so you will not be surprised by the hard parts and will not despair when they come. Stability, stabilitas, is the vow that makes the whole structure possible. And it is also, perhaps, the most quietly radical thing Benedict ever asked of anyone. A monk who makes the Benedictine vows binds himself not simply to poverty, chastity, and obedience in the abstract, but to a particular abbey, a particular hillside, a particular community of men he did not choose and cannot trade in for better ones when the trial gets hard. He commits, in effect, to staying. Not staying because the community is easy, or because his brothers are congenial, or because the work suits his talents. Staying because God has placed him there, and the desert fathers whom Benedict revered had already learned, at great cost, that the soul who keeps moving in search of a friendlier wilderness is usually running from the one enemy that travels with him everywhere, himself. Benedict knew this from both directions. He had been the man who fled. Rome had frightened him enough that he left it entirely, and there is no shame recorded anywhere in his story for that flight, because Rome asked of him a life he could not have lived without losing his soul. But he had also been the abbot at Vicovaro, who discovered that some communities will try to poison a shepherd who insists on shepherding. And he had watched, later, monks scatter across mountainsides in the chaos after the Lombards came, and he had built and lost and rebuilt what Monte Cassino would eventually become. He understood, better than most men who ever wrote about religious life, that there is a flight that saves a soul, and a flight that only postpones its reckoning. Stability in the rule is Benedict's mature answer to that difference. Flee the world if the world will destroy what God is building in you, as he fled Rome. But once you have found the ground God has given you to stand on it. Do not go looking for a purer monastery, a holier abbot, an easier community, when the ground you already have has simply become difficult. The difficulty may be exactly the material God intends to use, conversation morum, that harder to translate vow, the ongoing conversion of life, travels alongside stability like its necessary twin, because Benedict knew that a man could stay in one place his whole life and still never change at all. Stability without conversion hardens into mere habit. Conversion without stability dissolves into restlessness, dressed up as spiritual seeking. Benedict asks for both at once. Stay, and let the staying transform you. He had lived this too, in his own way. The cave did not change when Benedict lived there for 3 years, but Benedict changed inside it, day by day, in ways no single dramatic event could have produced. Monte Cassino's hillside did not change either, once the temple came down and the walls went up. What changed was every monk who walked through its gate and remained long enough to be worn, slowly, into something closer to Christ. And then there is the rule's most tender chapter, the one that surprises readers who come to Benedict expecting only austerity. Chapter 53, on the reception of guests. All guests who present themselves, Benedict writes, are to be received as Christ, for he is going to say, I was a stranger, and you took me in. The abbot is to wash the hands of arriving guests. The whole community is to show them every courtesy. Even the poor and the pilgrims, Benedict insists, deserve the most particular care, because in them Christ is received still more truly. This is not a rule for innkeepers, it is theology dressed as etiquette, and it did not come to Benedict from a manual. It came from a man who had once been, himself, entirely dependent on the welcome of strangers, the hermit fed by monks who barely knew him, the boy who arrived unannounced at Enfield with no household, no name yet made, no claim on anyone's charity, but the claim every human being has simply by arriving hungry at another person's door. Benedict had been the guest before he ever had gates of his own to open. He knew, from the inside, what it costs a man to knock on a door not knowing whether it will open. And he built into the rule an absolute, undebatable answer: it will open. Whoever comes, whatever their rank, whatever the hour. The door of a Benedictine house opens, because behind every traveler's face Benedict had learned to see the possibility of Christ himself standing there, patient, waiting to be let in. It would be a mistake to read the rule, even now, as a document written for monks alone, tucked away behind cloister walls where it can be admired but not touched. Benedict addresses his reader directly, and often in the second person. You, not the monk, not religious in general. And that address has never really stopped in the 15 centuries since he set his pen down at Monte Cassino. Kings have read the rule and found themselves instructed. Popes have read it. Farmers, teachers, mothers managing a household on no sleep, oblates trying to hold a rhythm of prayer and work inside lives that have no cloister walls at all. All of them have opened these 73 chapters and heard, unmistakably, a voice speaking to them, not about them. That is what happens when a rule is not legislation handed down from a committee, but the distilled memory of a single soul who lived every failure and every mercy it describes before he dared to write any of it as instruction for someone else. He does not open with threats. He opens, in that first line of the prologue, with an invitation gentler than anything the reader might expect from a man who had survived what Benedict had survived. Listen, my son, and incline the ear of your heart. Then, a few lines later, almost tenderly, let us open our eyes to the deifying light. Let us hear with startled ears what the divine voice cries daily to us. And a little further still, the line that has outlived every empire that rose or fell in the centuries since he wrote it. Run, while you have the light of life, that the darkness of death may not overtake you. He knew that darkness. He had sat in it for 3 years above Subiaco, with nothing but a rope and a bell, and his own unproven faith to keep him company. He wrote the rule the way he had lived everything else. Not from a height, looking down at ordinary struggling people, but from within the struggle itself, having found, at the bottom of it, that God had been there the whole time, waiting to be listened to. That is the voice the rule still carries. Not a magistrate's voice, a father's. The house stood halfway between 2 ways of life, and that was exactly why it existed. It belonged to the monastery, a modest farmhouse at the foot of the mountain, close enough to Monte Cassino that Benedict could walk to it in an afternoon, far enough that it was not the cloister. Once a year he came down to it, and once a year his sister came up from her own small community 5 miles off, at a place called Plombariola, and for one day brother and sister sat together at a table and talked of nothing but God. This had been the pattern for years. Neither of them broke it, and neither of them, it seems, ever wanted more of it than this. One day, given entirely to praise, and then the long return to their separate rules. Her name was Scholastica. Tradition holds she was his twin, born of the same mother in the same hour in Nursia, and that from her earliest years she had been given to God as holy and as early as Benedict himself had once fled to Infide, with nothing but a nurse and a longing. If Benedict's road to God ran through a city that frightened him and a cave that formed him, hers seems to have needed no such detour. She was, by every account the tradition preserves, holy almost from the cradle, the kind of soul for whom the ascent to God was less a struggle than a homecoming she had never really left. They had not seen much of each other across the years that made him a hermit, a reluctant abbot, and finally the father of Monte Cassino. But the bond between them did not thin with distance, it concentrated. By the time we meet them in this chapter, in the last winter of Scholastica's life, the two of them are old in years, old in prayer, old in the particular way that people become who have spent decades wanting only one thing. And once a year, this one meeting, this one meal, this one long conversation held nothing back, because there was, by then, so little of anything else to hold. On this occasion, as always, they spent the day as they had spent every other, in the praise of God, in the sweet exchange of holy conversation. Gregory the Great tells us, two souls doing on earth what they hoped soon to do, without ceasing in heaven. And as always, when darkness began to close in, they ate together, and the meal ran long, because it always did on this one day, and because neither wanted the day to end. But this time something in Scholastica would not let it end. She asked her brother to stay the night. Not the house, the presence. Stay, she said, and let us go on until morning, speaking of the joys of heaven's life. Benedict refused. We should not read cruelty into this. We should read the whole of the man we have followed for 6 chapters. The boy who walked out of Rome rather than be shaped by it. The hermit who beat back the memory of a woman's face with brambles. The abbot who told his monks that nothing was to be preferred to the work of God, and that the work of God kept its hours. Benedict's whole life had been an argument, waged against his own softness as much as anyone else's, that holiness lived inside discipline and not outside it. He could not possibly spend a night away from his monastery merely because his heart wanted to. What would it mean to reserve for the rule everyone else's flesh and blood, and grant his own an exception? He told her, gently but plainly, that he could not stay away from his cell. And this is where the story stops being merely tender and becomes something else. Something that has startled and delighted readers of Gregory's dialogues for 14 centuries. Scholastica did not argue. She put her hands together on the table, bowed her head over them, and prayed. When she lifted her face again, the sky broke open. It was not an ordinary rain. Gregory is careful about this, and so should we be. This was thunder and lightning and a downpour so violent that Benedict, a man who had walked mountain paths in every season, who had lived 3 years in a cave through Subiaco's bitter winters, could not so much as put his foot across the threshold. The storm did not merely discourage the walk back to the monastery. It made the walk impossible. Man and monks alike stood at the door and stared out at a night that had, in the space of a prayer, turned itself against every plan Benedict had made for it. He understood at once what had happened, and he said so. God forgive you, sister, he said. What have you done? And Scholastica, we are told, answered him without a trace of triumph, only fact. I asked a favor of you, and you refused me. I asked it of God, and he granted it. There is a whole theology folded into that sentence, and it is worth sitting with before we move on, because this small exchange between a brother and sister in a farmhouse kitchen carries weight far beyond the storm that occasioned it. Benedict had spent his entire life building an architecture of discipline meant to protect love from becoming mere sentiment. The rule's insistence that nothing be preferred to Christ, that stability hold a monk in place against every restless impulse of the heart, that obedience come before preference every single time. And here, in one evening, his own sister showed him that the deepest obedience is not always obedience to a schedule. Sometimes it is obedience to love itself, when love has gone first to God and asked him to arrange the world so that charity might win. Scholastica did not break Benedict's rule. She went over his head. She took the matter to the only authority higher than an abbot's discretion, and she came back with a night neither of them would ever forget. He gave in, because there was, quite literally, nothing else to do, and they spent that whole night as they had spent the day, talking of the interior life, of the soul's longing for God, of the joy that waited on the far side of every discipline either of them had ever kept. Gregory tells us it was a night given wholly to holy conversation, the two of them drawing out for each other, perhaps for the last time, everything each had learned in a lifetime of ora et labora, she in her small community of women, he on his hill that had once known only Apollo. Neither of them presumably slept much. Neither presumably wanted to. Morning came, as mornings do even after nights like that one, and the storm that had held them together the evening before had passed as suddenly as it had risen. The sky was clear. The road back to Monte Cassino was dry enough to walk. Benedict returned to his monastery, to his cell, to the rule he had spent years distilling out of a life already lived, and Scholastica returned to Plombriola, to her own small community, to whatever measure of days remained to her. It was 3 days. 3 days later, Benedict was in his cell at Monte Cassino, the same high room tradition holds, from which he had once looked out and seen, in a single ray of light, the whole world gathered, as if it could be held in one glance. And looking out from that cell now, he saw something else. He saw his sister's soul leave her body, in the form of a dove, and rise into the open vault of heaven. This is one of the most tender images in the entire tradition that has come down to us about Benedict, and it deserves to be looked at slowly rather than hurried past. A dove, the same figure Scripture reaches for again and again when it wants to speak of the Holy Spirit descending gently upon the waters, upon the Jordan, upon the frightened disciples in the upper room. Gregory does not tell us that Benedict merely learned of his sister's death through some ordinary report carried up the mountain by a messenger. He tells us that Benedict saw it happen, watched the soul itself take flight, watched it climb through the brightness of the sky until it passed from his sight into the deep places of heaven that no eye, however holy, can follow. Overjoyed at the sight, this is Gregory's own word, and it is exactly right, joy rather than merely grief. Benedict gave thanks to God with hymns and words of praise. Only after the vision had passed did he send word to his community, announcing what had happened to his sister, and asking that her body be brought to Monte Cassino. Notice what he did next, because it tells us something about the whole shape of the bond we have been tracing through this chapter. Benedict had already had a tomb prepared for himself at Monte Cassino, in the ordinary course of a monastery's life, a place set aside for the day when its abbot would finally lay down the labor he had carried for so long. When Scholastica's body arrived, he had it placed in that same tomb, his own tomb, the one meant for him, and there she waited. And when Benedict himself died, not long afterward, he was laid in that same grave beside her, so that, in Gregory's words, which the whole tradition has cherished ever since, the bodies of these two, who had always been one in mind, were not separated even in the grave. It is worth pausing on that phrase, because it is the real center of this chapter, more than the storm, more than the dove. One in mind. Two people who had spent their entire adult lives apart. He on his hill, she at Plombariola. 5 miles and an entire life of discipline standing between them. And who met, by rule, exactly once a year, for exactly 1 day. And yet the tradition insists, and insists rightly, that this was not distance in any sense that mattered. It was stability lived out in 2 directions at once, each of them faithful to the particular community God had given them, each of them refusing every restless impulse to abandon that community for the other's company. And precisely because of that fidelity, the bond between them grew, rather than thinned, with every year that held them apart. We should not read Benedict's initial refusal to stay the night as coldness, and we should not read Scholastica's prayer as a rebuke of her brother's discipline. Read together. Refusal and prayer are 2 halves of the same love, working from opposite directions toward the same end. Benedict guarded the rule because he had learned at terrible cost in a cave above Subiaco that a soul without structure collapses into whatever the nearest temptation offers. Scholastica guarded something Benedict's rule could never fully contain, the plain fact that love sometimes needs 1 more hour than discipline is willing to give, and that God himself, when asked properly, is not above rearranging the weather to grant it. This is why generations of readers, monks, oblates, ordinary Christians who have never set foot in a cloister have loved this story more than almost any other episode in Benedict's life. It is not really a story about a storm. It is a story about what happens when someone who has organized her whole existence around obedience to God discovers that this same God will, on rare and particular occasions, break every rule of ordinary weather to give 1 more evening to 2 people who love him and each other in the same breath. Scholastica's prayer was not disobedience dressed up as piety. It was the deepest obedience of all, obedience to the truth that charity outranks even the wisest rule, because every rule, Benedict's included, exists only to serve charity in the first place. There is a line, late in the rule, where Benedict tells his monks that they are to prefer nothing whatever to Christ. We read that line in chapter 6 of this book and understood it as the axis around which his whole community turned. But Scholastica's reign teaches us something the rule alone could not, that preferring nothing to Christ does not mean preferring nothing to love. It means, instead, that when love is real, when it has been purified across years of separate faithfulness in separate places, it becomes indistinguishable from the love of Christ himself, and God will bend the sky to protect it for 1 more night. Every oblate who has ever kept a rule of life while loving a spouse, a child, a friend, a community that pulls against the schedule the rule prescribes, has stood exactly where Benedict stood at that door, staring out at rain that has made his careful plan impossible. And every one of them has learned, or is learning still, what Benedict learned that night. That sometimes the most faithful thing a disciplined heart can do is to let itself be interrupted by a love it did not plan for, and to recognize, in the interruption, the hand of the same God the discipline was built to serve. Scholastica died within days of that storm, but she did not die outside her brother's life. She died if the vision granted him is to be trusted, and the whole tradition trusts it, rising like a dove past the very window from which Benedict had once seen the whole created world folded into a single ray of light. It is hard not to hear an echo between those 2 visions, chapters apart in this book and years apart in his life. In the first, Benedict saw all of creation gathered into the light of God and understood, in that instant, how small the world truly is beside the one who made it. In the second, he watched the soul dearest to him on earth swept up into that same light, going home ahead of him by only a few years, taking with her every unspoken word from that last long night of conversation about the joys that were for her no longer merely spoken of, but entered. He buried her in his own grave and went back to his cell, and to the rule, and to the daily hours of the work of God that still awaited him, because stability does not end at the door of grief. It carries a man through it. Benedict had a monastery to father still, monks who needed him, a rule not yet finished being lived before it could be finished being written. But something in Monte Cassino's air was different after that winter. Quieter, perhaps, in the particular way a house is quieter once it holds the grave of someone who has already gone ahead. He would not have to wait long to join her there. And when he did, no one who had heard the story of the rain and the dove could think of it as two burials. It was one love, finally allowed to keep the room together, that a single night's storm had once, briefly and gloriously, refused to let end. 6 days before he died, Benedict asked his monks to open his grave. There was no fear in the request, no theatrical flourish. It was an instruction, given the way he gave every instruction at Monte Cassino, plainly, and expecting to be obeyed. The brothers dug where he told them to dig, in the oratory he had built on the hill's old crown, where the altar to Apollo had once stood, and where, years before, his own sister Scholastica had been laid to rest. They did not ask him why. By then they had learned that Benedict rarely said things without reason, and that the reasons often arrived only afterward, quietly, the way a door proves to have been the right one only once you are through it. The fever came on the 6th day. Gregory the Great, writing some 40 years later from testimony gathered among Benedict's own disciples, tells us that the old abbot bore it the way he had borne everything else in that long life. The hunger of Sacro Specco, the treachery of Vicovaro, the grief of a Roman winter that had taken his twin, with a stillness that was not resignation but attention. He was watching for something. He had spent 70 years learning to watch, and he was not going to stop now, at the threshold, when the watching mattered most. On the last day he asked to be carried to the oratory. His arms would not have held his own weight by then. The brothers bore him between them, the way they had once carried grain up the hill, the way Scholastica's soul had once been carried off in the shape of a dove. In the oratory he received the body and blood of the Lord, the Eucharist that had stood, every day of his monastic life, at the center of hours he had once described in the rule as more urgent than anything else a monk might be asked to do. Nothing was to be preferred to the work of God. He had written that sentence for his sons. Now he was living its last application. And then, Gregory tells us, supported by the hands of the disciples who stood on either side of him, Benedict raised his own hands toward heaven. He did not fall into their arms. He did not slump or fail. He stood, an old man, worn through by fever and by 80-some years that had asked everything of him, with his hands lifted the way a priest lifts his hands over the altar, the way a man lifts his hands when he means, with his whole body, to say yes. He was praying. He was praying when he died. There was no separation between the two acts, no seam where the prayer ended and the dying began. They were the same motion, the last and simplest fulfillment of a life that had never really been about anything else. The boy who had left Rome because the noise of it frightened him. The hermit who had prayed alone in a cave for 3 years with only Romanus and a bell rope between him and starvation. The abbot who had told his monks that idleness was the enemy of the soul, and had then ordered every hour of the day so that idleness would have nowhere to hide. That whole life came to its point in a single, upright praying posture, and then it was finished. The date the tradition keeps is the 21st of March, in the year 547. Gregory adds one more detail, and it is the kind of detail a lesser biographer would have left out for fear of sounding fanciful. But Gregory, writing 40 years after the fact, from monks who had known monks who were there, sets it down without apology, because he believed it, and the church after him has believed it too. 2 of Benedict's monks in 2 different places were given the same vision on the same night. One was at Monte Cassino itself, the other was some distance away. Each of them independently saw a road running from the monastery eastward, all the way to the sky, decked from end to end with lights, glowing as if laid with a carpet of stars, with a figure in shining robes standing at its head. A voice told the monk, who was farther away, what he was looking at. "This," the voice said, "is the road by which Benedict, beloved of the Lord, has ascended to heaven. It is worth sitting with that image rather than hurrying past it, because it says, in the language of vision, exactly what the whole life had been building toward. A road. Not a leap, not a sudden translation, but a road. The kind of thing you walk, one stretch at a time. The way Benedict had walked the distance between Nursia and Rome, between Rome and Enfide, between Enfide and the cave above Subiaco, between Subiaco and the hill at Monte Cassino. Stability, transfigured. The same commitment to one path, one direction, one fidelity, carried all the way through, had become, in the vision granted to those 2 grieving monks, a literal road of light leading home. Stabilitas had always meant staying in one place until that place became passage enough into the next world. Now the monks were shown what that looked like from the other side. They buried him in the same grave his sister had occupied for a little less than a month. Brother and sister, twins from the same womb near Nursia, who had spent most of their adult lives only a few miles apart and had seen each other, by Gregory's account, only once a year, reunited now in the ground of a hill that had once belonged to Apollo, under an oratory Benedict himself had raised on the ruin of the old god's altar. It is difficult to imagine an ending more precisely shaped to the whole arc of his life. The place that had known only pagan sacrifice now held 2 Christian bodies, bound by blood, and by a common death 11 days apart, waiting together for a bell they believed would ring. The monastery did not stay peaceful for long. Within 30 years the Lombards came down through Italy, and, sometime around 577, put Monte Cassino to the torch. The monks who survived did not scatter without purpose. They gathered what mattered most, the text of the rule, the sacred vessels, whatever relics they could carry, and fled south to Rome, where Pope Pelagius II gave them shelter near the Lateran. For more than a century, the hilltop Benedict had built lay empty, its oratory roofless, its cloister given back to weeds. And yet the thing Benedict had actually made, not the buildings, but the rule itself, the pattern of ora et labora he had distilled from a life already lived, went right on working in exile. It did not need the hill to survive. It only needed monks willing to keep it. And there were always monks willing to keep it. Monte Cassino itself was eventually rebuilt, around the year 718, by a nobleman turned monk named Patriarch of Brescia, who climbed the hill, found a handful of hermits already living quietly among the ruins, and set about restoring the walls stone by stone. It would not be the last time the abbey had to be rebuilt. Within 2 centuries the Saracens would sack it again. An earthquake would bring down its church in the 14th century. Napoleon's armies would suppress it in the early 19th. And in February of 1944, in the middle of the worst war the modern world had ever fought, Allied bombers reduced the entire hilltop, church, library, cloister, everything Patriarch and the centuries after him had rebuilt, to gray rubble in a single day, on the mistaken belief that German troops were using the abbey as an artillery post. Photographs from that February show a mountain of stone dust where a monastery of 1400 years standing had been. It looked, to anyone seeing it for the first time, like the end of something. It was not the end of something. It had never been the end of something, not once, in all the centuries this had happened before. Because the actual life of what Benedict had built was never really housed in the stone. It lived in the rule, and the rule had already left the building long before the building fell, carried out, copied, argued over, and lived by monks who had, over 4 centuries, taken it from a single hilltop in southern Italy and planted it across the whole breadth of a continent that was, when Benedict wrote it, barely holding itself together. That spread had not been automatic. For a long time after Benedict's death, the rule was one option among several available to monastic founders, sharing space with older rules and looser customs across Gaul, Ireland, Britain, Spain. It was Charlemagne, and after him his son Louis the Pious, working through the reforming energy of an abbot named Benedict of Nursia, who changed that. At a great council held at Aachen in 817, the Frankish Empire formally adopted the rule of Benedict as the standard for every monastery within its reach, displacing the patchwork of local customs that had grown up in the centuries since Monte Cassino first burned. From that council onward, to enter a monastery almost anywhere in Latin Christendom was to enter under Benedict's rule. The scaffolding he had built for a few dozen monks on one Italian hillside became, without his ever intending it, the scaffolding for European monastic life entire, the pattern by which barbarian kingdoms learned to keep books, till fields in rotation, care for the sick, copy the scriptures, and mark the hours of the day and the seasons of the year with prayer. Historians of the era that followed Rome's collapse have a name for what the monasteries did during those centuries. They kept the lights on. Benedict had not set out to save a civilization. He had only wanted, in a cave above Subiaco, to escape one that was collapsing around him, and to find God in the silence left behind. The saving of the civilization turned out to be what obedience to that silence produced, generations later, almost as a byproduct. Which is why, when Pope Paul VI stood at the rebuilt Abbey of Monte Cassino in October of 1964, the rubble of 1944 cleared away, the church and cloister raised again stone by stone, exactly as Patriarch had once raised them after the Lombards, and solemnly declared Benedict the patron of Europe. He was not awarding a title so much as recognizing a debt centuries old. The declaration named what had already been true for 400 years before Charlemagne ever called his council, that the continent's memory, its learning, its agriculture, its very rhythm of labor and rest, had been shaped in the scriptoria and the fields and the choir stalls of monasteries, following one man's rule. Paul VI stood in a church that had been destroyed and rebuilt more times than anyone could easily count. And he said, in effect, that the man buried somewhere beneath that hill had fathered more of Europe than any king. The church keeps 2 days for him now, and both matter, though for different reasons. The old calendar remembered the 21st of March, the actual day of his death, the day the monks saw the road of light. But March falls almost always within Lent, a season the church keeps free of most solemn feasts. So the modern calendar moved his principal celebration to the 11th of July instead, the date associated with the 9th century translation of his relics. Monastic communities that follow the older calendars still keep March 21st as a quieter commemoration, a family remembering the exact hour. July 11th has become the day the wider church and the whole extended family of monks, nuns, and oblates that traces its life back to him keeps as his solemnity. On that day, in Benedictine houses on every continent, the readings turn to Gregory's account of the death, the same account this chapter has just retold: the fever, the open grave, the Eucharist, the hands raised. Communities that have never seen Italy and never will read the story of a hilltop most of them will never visit, and something in them recognizes it as their own history, because in the way that matters most it is. That is not sentiment, it is genealogy. Every monk professed under the rule today, every nun who rises for vigils in the dark, the way Benedict's first monks rose at Monte Cassino, every oblate who has promised, as you, reading this, may one day promise, or may already have promised, to live the spirit of stability and conversation morum outside the cloister walls, stands in a direct, unbroken line back to the man who raised his hands toward heaven in an oratory built over an altar to Apollo. The line was broken by fire more than once. Lombards broke it, Saracens broke it, an earthquake broke it, Napoleon broke it, an Allied bombing run broke it, as completely as anything can be broken. And every single time, someone came back up the hill, a Petronax, a handful of monks with nothing but the memory of the rule and the will to keep it, and started again. That pattern is, itself, the clearest proof that what Benedict founded was never really a building. It was a way of being faithful that could survive the loss of every building it was ever given. So when his feast comes around each July, and the readings are read again, and somewhere a novice hears for the first time the story of the hands raised in prayer, it is not a memorial for something finished. It is a family keeping its Father's Day the way families do. Not to look backward only, but to recognize once more whose house they are still living in. The bell at the guest house doors still rings the way it rang 15 centuries ago. Not electric, not urgent, just a rope and a weight and a sound that carries across a cloister garden at dusk. Somewhere behind the door, a monk sets down whatever he was doing. He comes to the small window built into the gate, the one designed so that no stranger is ever admitted before he is known, and he asks, as the porter of every Benedictine house has asked since the rule first told him to, the only question that matters before any other can be answered: what do you seek? It is not idle. The rule itself insists on it. Before a new brother crosses the threshold into the life, before vows, before the habit, before even a bed is made ready for him, someone must ask him plainly what he is looking for, and he must be made to wait at the door until the answer is tested by patience, by delay, by the discomfort of standing outside a little longer than feels comfortable. Benedict knew that a man who has never been asked what he seeks will not know, later, when the seeking grows hard, what it was he came for in the first place. I am asking you now, at this threshold, the same question the porter asks. You have spent 8 chapters with a boy from Nursia who fled a city, a young man who disappeared into a cave, an abbot who was nearly poisoned by his own monks, a brother who argued with his sister across a table until the sky itself intervened, a dying man who asked to be carried into a chapel so he could meet his end on his feet, hands lifted toward the heaven he had spent 70 years learning to desire. You have met him in a single ray of light falling through a window at Monte Cassino. The whole world gathered into one gaze, the way Gregory the Great once described it. If something in you has leaned forward during any of these pages, if some part of you recognized, however faintly, a man worth knowing further, then you already have your answer. You did not open this book by accident. This has been an invitation, and invitations are, by their nature, incomplete. I have shown you, Benedict, the way you might glimpse someone through a doorway left ajar, enough to know the shape of the room, not enough to have sat down in it. What follows this book is the room itself. 3 volumes, each one whole, each one written the way the man himself lived. Unhurried, exact, built to last. The first volume waits for you in Subiaco, 35 miles east of the Rome that frightened a young man so badly he abandoned his studies and his family's name and walked away from every future that had been laid out for him. That book is the story of the cave, the Sacro Specco, the sacred cave above the lake, where a 20-year-old spent 3 years with no one but a monk named Romanus lowering bread down to him on a rope, and no company but silence, and no teacher but the God he had come there specifically to stop running from. You have already stood at the mouth of that cave in this book's 3rd chapter. But a glimpse is not a dwelling. The first volume takes you inside for the full 3 years. The cold, the hunger, the temptation that drove him to roll naked in briars until the fire in his blood went out. The slow and often unglamorous work of a soul being remade in the dark before it ever did anything the world would notice. It is the volume of formation. It answers the question every reader eventually asks about any great life. What happens to a person before they become who we remember them as? Long before Monte Cassino, before the rule, before thousands of monasteries carried his name across Europe, there was a young man in a hole in a hillside who had nothing to offer God but his presence, and who discovered that this was enough. If you want to understand where Benedict's authority came from, why monks would eventually trust a man barely older than they were to govern their souls, you have to go back to that cave. Authority like his is never granted. It is carved. The 2nd volume takes you up onto the hill of Monte Cassino, to the temple of Apollo that had stood there since before Christ was born, and to the community Benedict built on its ruins after the desert had finished forming him and he could no longer stay hidden from other people's need. This is the volume of testing, because formation in solitude is one kind of trial, but formation in community is another altogether, and in many ways the harder one. You have already glimpsed its shadows in these chapters. The monks at Vicovaro who tried to poison their new abbot rather than live under a rule that asked anything real of them. The long, slow work of building 12 small monasteries at Subiaco out of men who had never lived disciplined lives before. The toppling of a pagan altar that had stood unchallenged for centuries, and the fury that followed. The fire that swept his own garden, the enemy who never stopped circling. And you have sat, in this book's 7th chapter, at that final table with his twin sister Scholastica, watching 2 people who loved each other argue past the edge of what either one was willing to give up, until heaven itself intervened with a storm neither of them had asked for. The 2nd volume gives you all of this in full. Not sketches, but the whole architecture of a life spent governing men who did not always want to be governed, loving a sister he could not always understand, and slowly discovering that the rule he would eventually write down had first to be lived, failure by failure, mercy by mercy, in the daily grind of an actual monastery on an actual hill. This is where ora et labora stops being a phrase and becomes a schedule. The bells, the fields, the scriptorium, the kitchen, the exhausting and holy ordinariness of Opus Dei, repeated 8 times a day, whether anyone felt like praying or not. If the first volume shows you a man being formed alone with God, The second shows you what that same man does when God hands him other souls to carry. It is not always gentle, it is always faithful. And it ends, as this book's 8th chapter began to show you, with an old man carried into a chapel to die on his feet, hands lifted, having spent every ounce of the strength that cave once gave him on the people God put in his path. The 3rd volume is different in kind from the other 2, though it grows out of both of them the way fruit grows out of root and stem. It is the volume of the rule itself, the 73 short chapters and the prologue that Benedict wrote at Monte Cassino near the end of his life, not as a legal code handed down from some height, but as the distilled wisdom of a man who had already lived every line of it before he ever picked up a pen. You met the rule's voice already in this book's 6th chapter, that single word "listen" with which the prologue opens, addressed not to monks in the abstract but to you, specifically, whoever you are, reading whenever you happen to be reading. The 3rd volume opens the whole of it, the chapters on humility that read like a ladder built out of a man's own falls and recoveries, the chapters on the abbot, who must hold the place of Christ for men who will one day answer to God for how he shepherded them, the chapters on silence, on hospitality, on the treatment of the sick and the elderly and the young, on how much wine a monk may drink and what he should do with his anger, and how a guest arriving at the gate unannounced is to be received as though Christ himself were standing there, because the rule insists he is. That volume follows the rule out of Monte Cassino, across the centuries after Rome's collapse, through the copying of manuscripts by candlelight that kept Latin learning alive when nearly everything else was burning, through the founding of monastery after monastery across a Europe that had forgotten how to read, until you arrive at 1964 in a hall in Rome, where Pope Paul VI stood before the world and named this same man, this same cave-dwelling hermit turned abbot, the patron of Europe, the recognition, centuries late and entirely earned, that an entire civilization owed its survival in no small part to men and women who had taken one broken hermit's handwritten instructions and simply, patiently obeyed them. And then that same volume brings the rule forward again, out of the past and into your own week, into the life of the oblate praying the hours from a kitchen table, into the parish reader who has never seen a cloister, but who has learned from these same 73 chapters how to sanctify an ordinary Tuesday. This is the volume that makes plain what has been implicit in all the others, that Benedict did not write for monks alone. He wrote for you. I want to be honest with you about what these 3 volumes are, because an invitation offered dishonestly is no gift at all. They are long. They dwell in places this short book could only visit. They will ask you to sit with silence the way Benedict himself sat with it, not rushing past the difficult chapters toward some tidy resolution, but staying, the way stability itself asks a monk to stay in one place, with one community, through one lifetime, when every instinct in a restless age says to move on the moment things grow hard. That is, after all, the whole shape of conversation morum, not a single dramatic conversion, but a lifelong turning, done again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. These books ask the same patience of a reader that the rule asks of a monk. They will not always move quickly. They were not written to, but I can tell you, having walked this ground myself, having prayed these same hours, having stood in that cave above Subiaco at an hour early enough that the birds had not yet started, having walked the long road up to Monte Cassino, the way pilgrims have walked it for 15 centuries, that what waits for you in those pages is not a burden but a homecoming. You will meet the same young man who fled Rome, but you will meet him at greater length, with room to breathe, room to fail, room to be forgiven. You will meet Scholastica again, not only in her last winter, but across the whole quiet arc of a sister's love for a brother who did not always make loving him easy. You will meet monks who tested his patience past what any reasonable man should have endured. And you will watch him, again and again, choose mercy over dismissal, correction over punishment, the shepherd's staff over the master's whip. And underneath all 3 volumes, holding them together the way stone holds together a wall built to outlast the mason, you will meet the rule itself, not as an artifact from a museum case, but as a voice still speaking, still asking you, this morning, this evening, at whatever hour you happen to open it. Listen, the porter is still standing at the gate. He has asked you what you seek, and if you have read this far, some answer has already begun forming in you, perhaps not in words yet, perhaps only as a kind of leaning toward the door. That is enough to begin. Benedict himself began with less. A young man from a Roman hill town, with no plan beyond escaping a city that frightened him, no map beyond a cave someone had once mentioned, no rule yet at all beyond the conviction that God was worth losing everything else to find. Everything that came after, the 12 monasteries, the hill that had known only Apollo, the 73 chapters, the 15 centuries of sons and daughters who would call him father, grew out of that one small, unglamorous, entirely sufficient beginning. So this is not a farewell. It is a door held open. Somewhere past it, in 3 volumes, waiting for exactly the kind of attention you have already shown these 9 chapters. A cave still holds its cold and its silence. A hill still remembers a temple falling and a monastery rising in its place. And a rule, written by a man who knew failure as intimately as he knew grace, still says the same word it said the first morning it was read aloud to a handful of tired monks at Monte Cassino, and still means it exactly as much now as it did then. Listen, it says, my son, my daughter, incline the ear of your heart. Go in, then, whenever you are ready. The bell has already been rung. Peace be with you on the way.